and welcome to another edition of Turned Out a Punk. I'm your host, Damian Abraham, and once again, I'm bringing you a conversation with someone who grew up listening to punk, may or may not still be involved with punk, but had their life changed by the genre in a major way. And today on the show, huge guest from the band Baxter, from the band Rise Against, Tim MCILRATH is here. And if you are not familiar with Tim, I don't know how I can help you on this one. You probably know Rise Against, and this is Rise Against week here on Turned Out a Punk, and I will get to more information on that and Tim, but trust me, this is awesome. This is an awesome episode, but more on that in 1 second. First, if you want to get in touch with me, head over to the email address, turnedoutapunkpodcast@gmail.com. That is run by my brother and show producer and guest booker extraordinaire, Tristan Abraham, and he will get the message to me. You can also find me on Twitter and Instagram at Left4Damian. If you want to support the show, the best way to support the show is by telling all your friends about it, letting them all know that you enjoy this podcast here that we do twice a week, sometimes three, maybe this week, hopefully, cross my fingers, 3 episodes, definitely 2, but cross my fingers, 3 episodes, and you can let your friends know that we do this thing and spread the word that way. You can also subscribe to it and rate it on your platform of choice, and thank you to everyone that does do that. And speaking of thanks, huge thank you to everyone that goes over to patreon.com/turnedoutapunk and supports the show that way. It is very, very much appreciated. Thank you to everyone that does do that. And speaking of thanks, this thing would not be possible without the kind support of the fine folks at Vans, who came aboard a few years ago and said, Damian, do what you do, just don't do it out of your own pocket, and help me cover some of the weird costs that come up doing a podcast, which, you know, I'm shocked. There's all these weird costs that keep coming up, and sounds like I'm joking, but I'm not. But so thank you. Thank you very much to the fine folks at Vans. I say fine folks, but the people over at their Vans for doing what they do. I miss them. I miss all my buddies, Chuck and the crew at House of Vans. And hopefully when this thing's over and we can travel again, I'll be back at a House of Vans and hanging out and in Chicago. In Chicago, which is a perfect segue to talk about today's guest, but I still need to talk to you about my band. I play in a band called Fucked Up. We got reissues coming out of our David Comes to Life record and a bunch of songs that came out on singles around that time on Matador Records. Head over to matadorrecords.com and check out those things. And also we're going to be coming on tour. Holy jeez, it feels weird to say that. We're going to be heading out on tour in the new year, and I can't wait to see some people. I cannot wait to see everyone. Some people. Everyone. I cannot wait to see everyone. Anyone. At this point, I cannot wait to see anyone. Oh. Anyway, that is over there at fuckedup.cc for more information on those shows. Okay, now it's time to talk about Chicago, because today on the show, we are talking about Tim MCILRATH. And if Tim is someone who I've wanted to have on the show for a long, long time. Zach Blair, of course, a good friend of the show, another member of Rise Against, and he has said for a long time, you got to have Tim on the show, and it just has never come together until now, and finally it has, and oh my gosh, was it worth the wait? This goes all over the place. Tim is the perfect guest for this show because he unites so many sort of disparate scenes that are happening at the same point in Chicago. And anyone that listens to this podcast, or has listened to this podcast, I should say, for an extended period of time, knows that 90s Chicago DIY hardcore is the best ever. Like, it's so fascinating, all the stuff that comes out of this from, obviously Fall Out Boy, Rise Against, we talk about Alkaline Trio, Smashing Pumpkins. 1/5 connects back to this punk thing. But it's all kind of coming out. And Los Crudos, Charles Bronson. Anyway, we get into all this stuff with Tim. I don't think I've got too many notes other than to tell you that Rise Against has a brand new album called Nowhere Generation. You can pick it up in stores. And check it out. It's a fantastic record. This is one of those bands, they just keep, consistently putting out awesome records, and they're just these people, real people that, well, you hear it. This conversation with Tim. He's awesome. All right. I'm not going to ramble on anymore. sit back, relax, and enjoy Tim MCILRATH on Turned Out a Punk. Tim, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Hey, Damian, it is my pleasure. I have been a sporadic listener of your show, so I'm happy to be on it.
Well, that is a joy to hear. And I spared you from showing you this off air before we started recording. Mm-hmm. But I have like a crazy, like it looks like that Charlie from Always Sunny in Philadelphia meme style note sheet in front of me, just listing bands and all this sort of stuff of questions I want to ask you.
Like the murder board from like a CSI episode, like trying to track down who did it.
Pretty much, it's the murder board of my mind emptied out on the page in front of me of Chicago bands, because I felt this. I interviewed Neil, who of course played with you in Baxter, a couple years ago, and I felt like your generation has such a great perspective on one of my favorite music scenes ever, which is this '90s Chicago hardcore boom, where it kind of becomes like the capital of hardcore in the '90s.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't know it at the time, but I think the older I got, the more perspective I got, and talking to people like you kind of gave me perspective about like how cool it was and how special it was. I mean, it always felt special to me, but I didn't know how to compare it to like anybody else's world.
Well, I'm going to get to that. Believe me. Okay. We got to start this off the way they all start off, which is, Tim, how did you get into punk? Do you remember the first time you ever came across the genre?
So I know that you asked this question because I listened to your podcast, and that actually it made me think about it, because I've been answering this question for about 20 years, but I've never really thought too deeply about it. Like, I feel like my memory, probably like a lot of people's memory, like doesn't always line up with like record release dates, mm-hmm. Like when I look back and see, oh, this album came out this year. So I actually hit up my best friend because I got into punk with him, and it was his older sister that I would credit with corrupting us and showing us punk rock. And I decided with my buddy yesterday that it was probably like, we were probably 6th or 7th grade, which was like 1989, 90, around there. Mm-hmm. And his sister was in high school, and she was at a private school. And anybody who knows anything about private schools, there's a disproportionate number of misfits in private schools usually. So so she was discovering all this stuff that wasn't on the radio, just like real subculture kind of stuff. Because at that point, all we really knew was on the radio, or like big metal bands like Metallica and Slayer and that kind of thing. And so she started discovering, like college rock, alternative, that kind of thing. And she wasn't into the heavier stuff, and that stuff she would kind of pass along to us. And some of the first bands that she passed along to us were like Peg Boy, who at that point were coming out of the ashes of Naked Ray Gun, and starting to play in Chicago, and Los Crudos, which was like, I think that I asked my buddy, like, why were we listening to Los Crudos in like 7th grade? And he was like, I think that there was a large like Latino population at his sister's school that were kind of getting into this stuff. And Crudos were from the Pilsen neighborhood, and they were starting to make a mark. And so we got into that really early too. And so we had this cool like line into like local Chicago punk right away while we were starting to discover some of the bigger punk bands around. But that's where I'll probably put like its genus, like its origin was like, I feel like everyone's got like my friend's older brother, my friend's older sister, or whatever. And that's my story, is like my friend's older sister kind of showed us all this really cool music. And that was just like everybody's punk story. It was the tip of the iceberg. Now we wanted to know so much more, like, who the hell are these bands? Why haven't we heard about them? Where do they play? Who listens to them? Are there other bands like them out there? And thus began the last 30 years of my life.
It's so fascinating too, because you're also getting sort of the two big streams of Chicago punk. You're getting that kind of like sort of college radio, indie rock kind of like, or like post-punk, post-hardcore kind of thing. And then you're also getting that DIY thing with Crudos. Like it's funny how you're getting like the complete range in those two bands.
Yeah, totally. And I think that was good because because Chicago had a very, I don't know, like maybe like a divided scene. You know, there was like different genres and different cliques. I think those walls were kind of pretty congealed by the time I was getting into the Chicago scene, but I didn't feel a part of those. I didn't feel like those walls were meant for me. I felt like they were meant for like a previous generation. And so it allowed me to bounce back and forth between all kinds of shows. You know what I mean? I felt just as comfortable at a Cap and Jazz show that I did at like an Extinction show, which was our local hardcore band, that I did at a Peg Boy show or a Blue Meanies show or a Bull Weevils show. You know, like I felt comfortable at all those places. I felt like I wanted to be there. And I didn't feel like anything was preventing me from being there. And I was there with Neil Hennessy, who you already have talked to. Mm-hmm. You know, we were discovering this stuff together, and we were just like sponges, right? Like we were just I don't know. Everything I saw was so exciting. You know, I loved all those bands, even though they were all so different. Like the Blue Meanies were so different than Los Crudos, but in my head, it was all kind of the same thing. You know, like I loved Crudos as much as I loved like the Smoking Popes, you know, who are very, very different bands. But to me, it was all just part of this really cool subculture that was creating something that felt special. And it felt like it was like I don't know, this kind of tribe that I was just sort of soaking up everything.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that too, because, you know, to me, you know, and other people that have come on the show have talked about it. It feels like, you know, you look at that Achtung Chicago compilation.
Oh, yeah, totally. Yep.
And it's like, what a range of bands that are being represented there. Like you've got, you know, Trenchmouth on there, and you've got like, you know, a little bit of everything, but at the same time, go on. Sorry.
I was going to say it was Crudos, it was Popes, it was Prophets of Rage, the original Prophets of Rage.
Yes.
Dan Sinker's short-lived band, who he was the editor of Punk Planet, right? And so he would go on to do Punk Planet, which was a super important zine, you know, at the time, because, you know, obviously we didn't have the internet. So that's how you found out about music, was played like things like Punk Planet or MRR or Heart Attack. And what else was on there? Cap and Jazz was on there. I mean, if you had a song on Octung Zui, that's like just as big as any radio single to me. You know, like I know all the songs by heart, like the Bull Evils and the Vindictives and, you know, all that. So I think Gage was on there. Like,
Gage is on, yeah.
Oh, that was such, I beat that.
I get one and two. Well, I get 1 and 2 confused. I'm always trying to remember which is on which, but like, oh my gosh, yeah, like it is such, like, to me, the perfect scene, because you've got like all that different kind of sounds happening at once. But then it seems like as it goes on, like a few short years, you know, and this has been brought up, Daryl brought it up from the Boll Weevils, there it does start kind of factioning off into like these little separate divided cliques.
Totally. Yeah. You know, wait, I want to make one quick point about the Achtung Zui comp, because I think this is funny. The Cap and Jazz song that is on there, I definitely lifted a guitar line in that intro, and it's in our song Ready to Fall, which is like one of our bigger songs. And like, it's totally straight from that specific song, from that specific comp that, you know, nobody would ever notice it, but like it's in the verse, and it's fully, because I remember learning how to play that Cap and Jazz song and then just loving that little riff, and it eventually made its way into a Rise Against song. So
that is awesome.
Yeah. I owe Cap and Jazz somewhere along the lines. Go ahead.
You go through that, like, as you're saying, like, you know, you bring up Cap and Jazz, who of course kind of invent, you know, that the kind of Midwest emo stuff in a lot of ways, or like certainly, you know, you have Crudos, you got the Smoking Popes, you know, as you brought up, Prophets of Rage, 8 Bark becomes someone else too. V-Verse, I think.
V-Reverse.
V-Reverse, that's it.
That was Doug Ward and 8 Bark. 8 Bark, what a crazy fucking band, 8 Bark. You know what I mean? Yeah. Nothing sounds like 8 Bark. Nothing sounded like 8 Bark ever, you know? So I was a big fan of 8 Bark, and then I was a big fan of V-Reverse. And, you know, there's a band, like, you are an encyclopedic like source of punk rock knowledge, and obviously even Chicago. But I don't know if you've heard of the band called Sidekick Kato. Are you familiar with that at all?
No, but actually I listened to some interview and you brought them up, and I was like, holy shit, who is this band?
So this was like, it wasn't that they were like I would use the word obscure, but they were just as like important and big as a lot of these bands, but they were very poorly documented. You know what I mean? Like they just didn't have like the label, the records. They never really recorded like the height of their career. They never made merch. You know what I mean? Like they were just sort of like this neighborhood band, but it was, I will say, like the most important band in my adolescence. It was like they were just this really powerful, cool band. I don't even know how to describe their sound exactly, but I know that I've been trying to like emulate it the rest of my life. You know, it was like it was almost like a pre-emo kind of emo world. Like what, like it was screamy but melodic, and it was the kind of just shows that would just like people would just go off, and I was one of those people. Like I was in those crowds. I followed them around like you would follow the Grateful Dead around. You know, if they were playing it anywhere, any basement, any house party. I got lucky because I was still young. I was like 15, so I didn't drive, but I became really good friends with the lead singer's little sister. And so obviously she knew all the parties that they were playing. She knew all of like the bowling alleys or the VFW halls that they were playing. And so we would just drive around the suburbs of Chicago and follow this band around. And God, they were, I can't tell you, like I can, this is how crazy it is. Like I can play songs on a guitar that I only saw them play live like 30 years ago.
That's wild.
And to this day, I could pick up a guitar and actually play the riffs. And this band was super important, but they fall through the cracks of the Chicago story. They really do. But in some ways, that kind of even makes it more like special to me. You know, it's like they really were just this sort of mythical band.
So do they have anything recorded? Like I've never heard of this band, but it sounds like something I dig.
Yeah, they were they were on Dyslexic Records, I believe, and they put out some stuff, and I'm sure you could find some stuff on Spotify as well. So yes, there is some stuff recorded. There was never, in my opinion, as like a super fan of Psychic Kato, I don't think they ever really captured their sound in a recording. And I guess like they were friends with all the bands that were playing at the time, you know, whether it was like Slapstick or, Bullyvils, all those bands. But they were very much like, even like misfits in the misfit crowd, you know, like they were kind of their own thing. They weren't very like scene-y, you know, they were just kind of existed in their own orbit. And I feel like their fans, like me, like we existed with them in that orbit. They weren't part of like any bigger thing, which I think like can hurt bands sometimes, you know, like being part of like that network is super important. Sometimes it's how you go on tour with each other. It's how you play shows together and get breaks and that kind of thing. Sometimes when you are just like so isolated, it hurts your your ability to keep it up over a long-term basis.
Yeah, especially in a place like Chicago where you have so much stuff coming out. Like I imagine like if you're not, I don't know, like, well, especially for someone outside of the city, like if you're not present for these live shows, you're not going to pick up on how important this band is.
Absolutely. Yeah. And they were one of those that kind of fell through the cracks. But if you find anybody that like saw them back in the day, the shows were just, you know, I don't know, legendary.
It's funny because it brings up a thing, like when we first started going on tour, Chicago was like the first place we started playing. And we had this thing that we would talk about called Chicago pricing. So if you went to Chicago and you found a record by a band from there, it would be more expensive than it would be anywhere else. Like all the other records would be moderately priced, and it was the only place that it was really like that. And like normally when you go to a place where the records are from, you know, they're all like super cheap, but there is like such a pride. Like, you know, Naked Ray Gun records were always at a premium when I was at Reckless versus when I was like somewhere else trying to buy them.
That's interesting. I never noticed that, but I guess I could totally see that being true.
Yeah, it is such a, I don't know, it's such a music town, like, and it's not, I guess historically, well, I guess Chicago blues obviously, but like, you know, like I don't know, maybe I'm just oblivious to it, but it doesn't seem like it was a big rock and roll town. You know, or even a big punk town, but then the DIY hardcore stuff exploded.
Yeah, like we don't have a ton of like huge, like marquee name success stories that came out of Chicago, like the way like maybe a town on one of the coasts would, you know, West Coast, East Coast, or Seattle, that kind of thing. Like, and obviously there are bands that came from Chicago and huge ones, like whether it's like the Pumpkins or maybe Disturbed or whatever, or in our world, like Alkaline Trio and Fall Out Boy. But like for the most part, It was a lot of bands. We're in there somewhere. I hope.
Yeah, somewhere.
Yeah. But like for the most part, it was just like, I think what our strengths was all of our, our little bands, our small bands, like Chicago, they call it like a city of neighborhoods because there's so many little neighborhoods that make up what makes Chicago great. And that's kind of what made Chicago great, was all of these little bands. And then what made them special in a lot of ways, is that they never did become that big. I mean, look at like Pegboy, like one of the most underrated punk rock bands on the planet, still this band that to me were like gods. And then when I left Chicago, it was hard to find people that were completely aware of them.
It's interesting, like, you bring up all the bands you kind of brought up, and I'd even lump Smashing Pumpkins in this because of James Iha and his connection to, like, I think his band was the Feds, like the other Feds from Chicago.
Oh, yeah. I didn't realize there was another Feds. I knew like probably the later Feds, which I didn't know the James Iha Feds.
Yeah, I guess he had like some punk band. Dan Panic brought him up when he was on the show as seeing him as one of the first punk bands he saw. But like,
oh wow.
So like all these bands that kind of explode from there are all products of the punk scene, like Fall Out Boy, yourselves. Like it's really like, this is where, Chicago gets its huge bands from.
Yeah. We were all playing shows together, like Alkaline Trio, Skiba was, I think, playing drums and Jerkwater back in the day. Yeah. Danny was in Tuesday before Trio. And then Tuesday was a Slapstick split off because when Slapstick, which was like our big ska band in Chicago. Yeah. And Slapstick was like a ska band in the way like that Operation Ivy was a ska band. You know what I mean? Like they were one of those like cream of the crop ska bands, like really just like, I feel like people can use ska as a dismissive term, mm-hmm. But like Slapstick were the real deal. And when Slapstick broke up, they formed the Broadways in Tuesday. And then there was that whole chain of the family that eventually turned into like Alkaline Trio, which was those three guys. And then, and even when I played in a band called The Honor System with half of the Broadways guys when they broke up, and then I was playing bass and singing for them around that same time. Sorry, I'm going off on a tangent of like family tree Chicago, but you're right.
This is
everybody
the bread
came.
And butter of this show.
Okay, well, good then. Everybody came from like a pretty like small Chicago scene, and even the Fall Out Boy guys, like we were all going to hardcore shows together. I grew up going to see, Earth Crisis and Integrity and Snapcase and Turmoil and Disembodied and Bloodlet and all those bands we were all going to see together. And Pete and I played in a band together called Arma Angelus. And then when that band broke up, that's kind of when Rise Against started. And then when Pete went on to do Fall Out Boy.
Well, believe me, we're going to get here. This is all,
okay.
This is all on the murder board. No, don't believe me. Don't worry. This is all on the murder board. We're going to get there. But where did you kind of go next from once you heard, these kind of two disparate kind of bands? Like, what was your next sort of steps on the punk journey?
So I had like two really good friends in like junior high, and we went way down the rabbit hole trying to discover everything we could discover, ordering catalogs from like SST Records or buying stuff through like the Sessions catalogs, or like it was all mail order back then, like sending cash away to like Underdog Records in Chicago. And we were still like in like 7th or 8th grade. So we weren't quite traveling into the city yet, but that would come and we would start going to Reckless and finding out more about Chicago. And then I think that besides my friend's older sister, sort of turning us on to a lot of stuff, I went away to a Boy Scout camp where I worked as like not quite a counselor, but like a counselor in training. I was too young
CIT?
to be a counselor. Yes, yeah. Exactly. Yeah, I was a CIT.
Yeah.
So I went to a camp where I was a CIT up in Wisconsin. It was called Camp Napawan. It was in Wild Rose, Wisconsin. And I'd already like was listening to a little bit of Black Flag and listening to Pegboy. And this one older counselor, and I remember his name was Jim Chambers. He found out that I was listening to Black Flag, and he was like, took me under his wing. He was like, wait, you need to know more then. And like him and a few other counselors were way into like punk, and he made me a mixtape. So I had like the mythical mixtape that we all get, right? That turns into the gateway drug to punk rock. And mine was like, Social D and Naked Ray Gun and Minor Threat. And I think the Subhumans were on there maybe. And then Fugazi was on there and Screeching Weasel was on there. And so this mixtape, which I remember his name because I wrote his name on the tape, I remember, and I had it for years. Not only did I spend a lot of time listening to it, but it turned into almost like an archaeological dig because I had to figure out who all these bands were, because I only had like a few songs from each of them. So I didn't even know what albums they were on. And I played that tape to death, and I desperately wanted to know more about these bands. We didn't have the internet, so it was all just kind of just asking a lot of questions or just finding out about the bands from other people and sort of networking and that kind of thing. And I just went down that huge rabbit hole. And that was all, very, very early 90s.
And what kind of stuff were you into before, this? You're super young getting into this, obviously, but like, what were you into before, hearing these bands?
I guess like, oh man. So I guess just metal, like I think that especially in like the mid 80s, like, Guns N' Roses was massive. You couldn't avoid them. Hair metal was massive. And I think I started and I had two older sisters who were way into hair metal. But they're also into like Billy Joel and that kind of thing. They were just kind of into like just mainstream stuff.
Yeah.
But every once in a while I'd hear something a little bit on the more aggressive side of their hair metal world, and I would be like, oh, that's kind of cool. And I remember listening to that was like Guns N' Roses or Skid Row, that type of stuff. And then that kind of led me into like Metallica and Iron Maiden and Slayer. And then I remember my friends and I probably like early teen years, we were all like way into like the metal, and that's, I guess that was what I was listening to before I discovered all the punk stuff.
Was there like any awareness of that Chicago metal stuff that was happening, like bands like Master, or I guess that stuff's like super underground?
Yeah, it's funny because this is kind of funny, but music was so hard to kind of get a hold of and find out about. It's hard to even imagine a world before the internet, but it was. But there was a local radio show in Chicago called VVX, I remember. Okay. And it came on maybe like Sunday nights, and me and my two best friends, we would put a blank tape in our boom boxes and we'd record the show. Because this was our way of hearing like about new bands. They would talk about the bands. They'd play the bands. And then we had a copy of the music, which was kind of crazy and bootleg and huge to have a copy of like actual music we could play back. And then we would, start to like figure out who those bands were. And then if we had enough money, we then go to a record store and try to like buy that stuff. So yeah, we were I don't remember the band Master, like that might've been before my time. But we were learning about like the greater Chicago area, and I had like a lot of metal fans because of this radio station, which I don't even remember what it was on, but I remember it was called VVX because we used to like write VVX on all our blank tapes.
It's amazing how like the idea of taping a radio show, it's almost like a proto podcast.
Yes.
Like it's in the same way that you're like, yeah, like because you would take this thing and yeah, I would do the same thing with college radio shows. You tape them on like a 60 or a 90-minute tape, and just try not to lose too much when you flipped it. But then you could have like you're saying, like it would be because information was so it was a commodity, right? Like you just couldn't get this stuff. You had to get this stuff.
Well, yeah, and especially in an underground world where mainstream magazines would show you pictures of what whoever the huge band of the day was. You could find that, and they'd be on TV maybe. But like underground music was not represented, nearly as well. That's what made zines so huge. I didn't know like what Jawbreaker looked like, until I saw a picture of them in MRR. Like I thought they were a 4-piece, like I had no clue, and so like those zines became really huge. Radio stations became huge because it was, information was this really scarce commodity, and then especially for like me, who was like a young kid in the suburbs who wasn't part of like any broader network yet, as you got older and you found your tribe, then I felt like, everybody kind of like filled in the blanks a little bit and you started to like know more about this stuff. And that also allowed for a lot of lore, a lot of mythology too, a lot of stories around punk rock because you were just passing the stuff on like word of mouth in some ways.
Oh, absolutely. Like I think that was part of the thrill, right? Like you'd hear, like, you brought up integrity, the stories you'd hear about integrity, and especially in Canada, they could never come here. So it was just like legend after legend, and then these sort of like grainy black and white photocopied photos and zines, and it just
Totally.
it becomes so much larger than life.
Absolutely. I remember Brandon, our drummer, Brandon Barnes, he moved to Chicago from Denver to play drums in Rise Against after playing in the band Pinhead Circus.
Incredible
And
band.
incredible band. Yeah. And Brandon's an incredible drummer, and we're so lucky to have him. And it's crazy how he even found his way to us. That's a different story. But I remember he came to Chicago. He didn't really know anybody. And at that point, I was really into like the hardcore scene. And Integrity was playing a show at a Knights of Columbus Hall in my town. And I remember just taking Brandon out, like, I want to show you like my friends and this hardcore scene, which in retrospect was so dumb. Like, Brandon doesn't give a shit about the hardcore scene. You know what I mean? Like, I know Brandon well now. So like, I think he kind of saw that and he was like, all right, cool. But I definitely, if he didn't care about the hardcore scene before, he definitely, after I brought him to an Integrity show, he definitely had good reason to, because I remember it was at this, this dark, smelly Knights of Columbus Hall outside of Chicago, and Integrity go on stage. And like you said, like Integrity always had like controversy around them.
Yeah.
They were always pissing somebody off. It was always some story. I don't remember what it was this time. Yeah. And so I kind of told Brandon, I'm like, I think something might go down. I don't really know. Anyway, so Integrity plays the entire show with no issue. And they had all the lights off in the Knights of Columbus Hall with like a strobe light going. And so it was dark except for the strobe light, so it was like kind of perfect for Integrity. It was like spooky and weird. And you didn't really see them on stage. You just saw like shadows on stage. Like, it was really cool. And the show went off like without a hitch. Nobody got violent. Nobody did anything. And at the end of the show, they finished their set and somebody turned the strobe light off before they turned the main lights on. And in those like 5-10 seconds of darkness, the lights go back on and DeWitt's got this huge black eye. Just this huge shiner. Like, somebody like waited for that moment and just clocked him. And no one even saw who it was, Yeah. And you could see Brandon like immediately questioning why he moved to Chicago to hang out with me. And like, he's like, what the fuck am I doing here? What am I joining? Is this what your band's going to sound like? What's happening here?
It's so funny because like they were the band that mastered that presentation, like that strobe light. And it's in punk, it's supposed to be no edifice, right? Like, you're supposed to, especially hardcore, you're supposed to just be who you are, get on stage, play in your normal clothes. But like, it's always the band that went that extra mile and gave themselves this like elaborate thing that become the legends. Like, you look at the Misfits, you look at Ink and Dagger, you look at, Integrity, like these bands that had this kind of like greater vision of showmanship, kind of crack the matrix with punk and hardcore.
Absolutely. And Integrity, like, they're all a vibe. They're all feel, they're all like DeWitt's lyrics, it's sort of, it's young people who, I don't know if they just were hip to that idea at a young age, or just had that vision. But you're right. Those are the bands that stay with us, because punk rock tells us not to have an image, right? Punk rock tells us that image is this like extra thing and it should be more stripped down. But like you said, like punk rock, is, and hardcore like does have an image, and in a way we respond to that image by remembering those bands and rewarding them with the notoriety we give them. Yeah.
It becomes like, it's almost like that's the bands that get remembered, or the bands that do step out, and the bands that at first everyone's like, oh, fuck this band. And then years later, people are like, no, that's the band,
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. Like you said, I can remember Ink and Dagger playing Fireside Bowl. And again, it was like strobe lights and light shows and that kind of thing. And I'll never forget it, because it was what they did was like, I mean, holy shit. It was like controversial what they did, it was like, it ruffled people, rubbed them the wrong way. They were like, well, who do they think they are?
They're fucking vampires. What the fuck is this? People were so angry.
Right. It was so like, it was just life and death back then. Like what you would do, what you wrote in a zine, what you said on stage, like, God, it was so, it was exciting. It was cool. Like living through like PC vegan straight edge bands, and then the PC backlash bands. And, how can we call like, and then you have bands that are in the same scene that were so different. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like Earth Crisis is a straight edge band, but so is Chokehold,
Yeah.
And so like, those two bands could not be further from each other, right? And I think they had beef too back in the day. Like, but or like Integrity and Snapcase were in the same scene.
Yep.
You know,
Yeah.
like and they might play a show together, and like that was exciting. Like that variety was really exciting to see that all like in the same show was like everyone's different take on what music means to them, you know, and that was pretty awesome because then as like somebody in the crowd, I got to just soak it all in like a sponge and just kind of see it all and love, you know, that like, you know, when Bloodlet came out, they were from Florida, so they had like this metal sound. That's where they were from, you know, and like Snapcase were from Buffalo and they had a sound that was very regional to that, you know, or, you know, you guys are up in Toronto, so you had like Grade came around and it was like, oh, this is really cool too, you know, and so it was that regional sound was real, you know, it made it like really special. I don't know if it's still around these days, but like, you know, in my experience, it was like a very real thing.
Yeah, no, I think it's kind of faded away because that information that we've been talking about that's so commodified is now, you know, like obviously there is, you know, acknowledging the barrier to entry to get to this information, but it's essentially all free once you can get there, you know, like
right.
You don't have it commodified in the same way. So I guess you got a free flow of it now. So yeah, like I've been talking to a lot of people and there's definitely this divide I've noticed on the show with people that kind of got into it post, you know, file sharing on music being much more of a thing where you have not even geographical scenes anymore, more like ideological scenes where you have people kind of connecting in, you know, vast expanses of space and coming together just over ideas more than like you're saying, like you don't really have to be lumped together with bands that don't necessarily sound like you anymore.
That's interesting. I never thought about that, but you're right. Like if we're going to eliminate like the distance between us, like the physical distance, then something else will connect us. And that will be, you're right. Like our ideas will put us into maybe like the different scenes and those, and then you'll find fans or an audience that those ideas will resonate with. That's interesting. That's like an interesting way to like watch the information superhighway, you know, like evolve the scene.
Mm-hmm. No, and I definitely think that it's like, you know, when I first started doing this thing, I was like, oh, well, it's the death of the scene, you know, but now I'm looking at it, I'm like, no, it's just changing. And it's like, it's always been something that changed.
Right. Because whenever you walked into the scene, there was some older grumpy guy saying that the scene was already dead too. You know, the scene's always dying. It's like it's always has been. It already happened. You missed it. You know.
Yeah.
But like realistically, it's being born again. Like as we speak, like today, like this week, it's like having a rebirth somewhere. You know, right now.
Oh yeah, no, it's amazing to think about like someone probably sitting in, just like completely out of control, negative approach show, just like watching everything go down and then being like, yeah, you guys should have been here when the Stooges played. This is nothing.
Oh God. It's totally true. I remember like there was I was in Fort Collins where we do a lot of our records with Bill, you know, and Bill, you know, everyone knows played in Black Flag, and one of Bill's roadies lives there, and he was working a bar one night, just checking IDs or whatever. And he was a little tipsy, you know, he's a little salty and drunk, and he's an old punker, and he used to tour with Black Flag. And every person that walked in the door, it was a punk show. Every person that walked in the door, he looked at their ID, looked up and goes, "You never saw Black Flag." And the next ID, "You never saw Black Flag." And he told that to every single person that walked in. And I remember like the next weekend, there was a sign on the door. It said, "To everybody I pissed off, I'm very sorry."
Well, at least he, recognize the error of his ways. But but it's just, I think that's part of what makes punk. That's like, I think what makes us all try so hard in our bands is because we've just been told that you're never going to be that good because the best bands have already come and gone.
Totally. And you know what's interesting too is like if I'm like a super fan of anybody, it's always been Ian MacKaye and everything he's done. And it's interesting because being a super fan, I've read his interviews. I grew up reading whatever he would say. And one of the things he always emphasized was like live in your own time and in your own scene, you know, don't don't try to, just live in the past or just mythologize my past or my experience. Like Minor Threat was my thing. I did it. Now you go do your thing, And that was like, I mean, if you think about even like the Fugazi song, is it Badmouth? You can't be what you were, so you better start being what you are,
Mm-hmm.
And like I feel like I got sound advice from a guy that I put on a pedestal, and he was kind of like, take me off this fucking pedestal and go do your own thing. And I felt like that was a really an empowering thing for me to hear as a young person.
I've always wondered why Discord never did like a more modern hardcore band, after obviously, they were doing all their stuff with their bands and sort of the Discord scene, but I always wonder why they never reached out to like, Battery would have been amazing, but
oh my God, yeah.
or even a Turnstile or Give or something like that. Like, I just,
or wasn't was Damnation AD from around there?
Yeah, that would have been amazing.
Right. Yeah.
Imagine Ibukai producing a Damnation AD record.
He seemed like he didn't want to get anywhere near like a new school straight edge hardcore scene. He wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole, I guess. But you're right. Discord would have been what a great home for a lot of that fun stuff that was happening. And not that there wasn't cool shit happening on Discord. I used to love like Kerosene 454 and Blue Tip, like those bands were super important to me. I'd watch them play all the time, and they had some good moments for sure. But you're right. Discord could have been harnessed for some bigger things.
Yeah, it's just fascinating. Like, obviously he's got his motivations for everything, and he's a very smart guy, and I'm sure he's got a great reason for it. But it's always just surprised me because, like it just seems like when you hear him talk, it would have been something they would have done. But going back to what's Bill. Bill, obviously an immense figure in punk and hardcore, also one of the most intense personalities I've ever met and toured with. Totally. How did that connection start?
Ooh, by accident, actually. I'm embarrassed to say that Bill was like our second or third choice to produce our second record, Revolutions Per Minute.
Yeah.
We had done our first record on Fat, which actually I think by the time this comes out, we'll have had its 20th anniversary.
Congratulations.
This month. Yeah, it's crazy to think about. And then when we were doing Revolutions Per Minute, which was our second record on Fat, we were a band that, not that we had like an identity crisis, but we wanted to be taken seriously as a band that could compete like in the hardcore world and wasn't just another band trying to emulate the Fat sound. Because at that point, the Fat sound was a real thing. The Epitaph sound was kind of like a real thing. And we were trying to like prove that we were more than that. We weren't just, not that there's anything wrong with that sound, but we knew that we had like a different thing to offer. And so we sought out some of the more hardcore producers, and we actually hit up Steve Evitz, I remember first, who had done like a Sick of It All record around that time. And then also that Turmoil record that sounds amazing. And we were like, oh, this guy will bring out the hardcore side of our band. He wasn't available. And then we sought out Brian McTernan. And through I think just some series of miscommunications. Like we thought we had time booked, and he was like, "No, you didn't." And like that, so goes like the band with no manager, and emails and voicemails and things like barely being organized. That's just the way it was. And so honestly, Bill was kind of like, "Oh shit, we need to record a record. Where are we gonna go?" And Bill was available, and I think we probably didn't consider him at first because I think we thought of him as like kind of a little bit of that Fat sound, like the guy who one of the guys who helps create it, like I guess like the most obvious guy being like Ryan Green, but Bill was doing Good Riddance records at that time and everything. That said, like ending up at the Blasting Room was probably one of the most pivotal moments of this band, and the reason that I'm probably still here talking to you, because we found our soulmates in the production world, in the music world, in the punk world, and just in like, just the friendship world. We just found a studio that we jived with immediately. Just like we were cut from the same cloth. Bill appreciated us and what we were doing. We appreciated him. He's like the Rise Against whisperer. He can like speak to all four of us like very effectively. He's a guy who like understands that we had a foot in punk and hardcore, but we never wanted to let it be a ceiling to what we were doing. And he wanted to push it. You know, we wanted to be this little engine that could make songs that we thought were good, but could also compete with anything you might hear on the radio, you know? And so Bill became like a mentor to us, like a guru of sorts, you know? And it's a really special thing. And even the older I get, the more special I realize it is, because I realize not every band has that relationship with a producer. You know, we became really good friends. I still talk to him like every week, you know. I've been on vacation with him. Our families are friends, you know, like he's just a really important character in my life. He's one of the biggest reasons like I am the songwriter that I am. You know, he gave me like the confidence to be the songwriter I am. Those records, those songs that you hear, like he is in every single part of it. So sorry, I went off on a Bill rant there.
No, because I think he's amazing. And you brought up something there where, you know, the loyalty that he has to the people that he loves, I find really special. Like, you know, the way he, you know, these bands that he works with, where he's not just like a producer where it's a gig. It's because the bands that he takes to, they become, you know, part of his life, it seems.
Absolutely. And he has this really intense discipline to what he does, which like, I don't know if that discipline was like a part of him before Black Flag, but like the more he tells stories about Black Flag, you realize the discipline that it took to be in that band. You know, like Greg made those guys work 8 hours a day, you know, for that band. They did everything. And I think that probably, you know, there's probably some trauma there, but there's also like, it instilled this really intense work ethic with a guy like Bill, where he doesn't waste a fucking second of the day, you know, and he gets frustrated if a second is wasted. Like he's very efficient and like functional and like, you know, I don't know. It's almost like, I think he talked about how like the punk bands on the East Coast would call his band like army punk. Cause it was like army time. It was like army, you know, like everything was like, he said Ian would call him Mr. Function, you know, it was all just this really intense discipline. And they brought that to the studio, to the blasting room. And so when we go there, it's like, it's all biz. Like they're not going to waste your time. You know, they're going to make the best sounding record. And then, but Bill, he does have a special connection to our music, and him and I have a special connection, like with like the lyrics and everything. Like he's the guy I want to impress. Like he's the bar that I'm trying to jump over, you know, every time. And I can't think of anybody else in my life that's like that, you know? So he makes me work harder. He makes me a better musician. It makes me a better person, like just by knowing him. He's such a deep and insightful and present person. And he's so talented. You know, he really pushed Rise Against through the womb. You know, he really got us out there. And I'm not sure that record and a lot of those records could have happened with anybody else.
Yeah. Like he just seems like that. Like even how Zach winds up getting in the band because he worked at Hagfish and he liked those dudes, you know, and then he does Only Crime with them. And so it just feels like, yeah, like he's this guy who looks at these bands as something that, I don't know, and he doesn't feel like he's overbearing, like he's trying to put himself into the picture too.
Oh, dude, no, he's the most selfless person for sure. You know, even as a producer, we all value his opinion so much, but there are times where if he says something and like, he's not sure if we're on board with him, he's never like stern about it. He's like, or I'm a 60-year-old punk guy, you know, who doesn't know what he's talking about. You know what I mean? Like he'll always sort of be really self-deprecating in that way. Cause I think he's so unaware of his own genius too. Like he's self-deprecating and like, he's one of those guys who's constantly surprised that he still doesn't have to work a real job, you know, like he just comes from that world where he's like, I can't believe I've been doing this for this long, you know? And so I don't know. He takes everything very, 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 very seriously and always questioning himself, never cocky about who he is. And also, you know, it's easy to forget that this guy is a pillar of the punk community that we all exist in. You know, when we talk about punk, we are standing on his shoulders, you know, like he really just was was there for just some of the most important moments of it. And Bill is obviously a phenomenal drummer, but he's also a phenomenal songwriter, music, lyrics, all of it, but also a businessman. Like they ingeniously built that studio with the advance they got from Interscope Records when all signed. And not just the advance, but also when Interscope dropped all, they got money for that. And instead of just like pocketing it, they built the studio, they bought their trucks so they don't have to rent tour buses. They bought their own merch company, like all of these things, they did. And it was such like I don't know, that it's their own version of like DC Punk, their own version of Discord Records, their own version of like DIY. And it's still existing to this day. Like that studio is where we make records, but like, I mean, big bands, bands like Day to Remember or the Lemonheads have made records there. I mean, Puddle of Mud made a record there, like this is all stuff that like comes from the punk world, bands from all over the world, come to make a record with Bill because they know his attention to detail is so unrivaled.
Yeah, no, it feels like, like you're saying, we're standing on these shoulders of these people, like, DOA as well. Like these bands had this work ethic like that. Punk gets this rap obviously from the mainstream of being super lazy, but when hardcore comes around, you have these bands that are like getting in vans, they're starting their own labels, they're really just kind of like, there's this work ethic like that's just, you don't
Totally.
really see, you see it in certain types of places in music, obviously, but like it certainly was something that we still kind of rely on today.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's sort of inspiring, like Ian will tell you that like Discord Records has always existed and they've never done a contract or they don't even have a lawyer. They're still pretty much just like kids in a treehouse, like making it up as they go along. And Bill's kind of the same way. He's never had like huge financial backing or a partner or whatever. Like they've done things very DIY. The way he runs that studio with everybody in the studio is like very communal. It's like a commune there. It's like he doesn't like, he's obviously like the marquee name over there, but he doesn't treat himself like that. He treats himself like, if you do work here, then you're rewarded. And if you don't do work here, then you aren't. Like he's not going to be the guy that's going to be like, well, it's my studio, because it really is all of their studio. And I guess I should say that too. Like Jason Livermore has been there forever. Andrew Berlin, Chris Biebel, like they're all making really cool records there. And then there's even like a new wave happening at Blasphemy too, where like they made the last record by that singer-songwriter Gregory Alan Isakov, which won a Grammy. Or no, did it win? I think it won. It was nominated and then I think it won. Yeah. So like that's the first record at the Blasting Room that has won a Grammy, which is pretty huge for a studio that got big, producing Good Riddance and Rise Against.
Yeah. No, it's amazing. It's amazing how, the where this stuff goes, and it's also, you brought up an interesting thing there with Discord and these, and even Cruise Records, right?
Mm.
Okay.
I always said Cruz, like Santa Cruz.
Yeah. For some reason I was saying Cruz, but I think that's like a 14-year-old pronunciation that I've just kind of held on to in my mind because I've never had to say it out loud too much. But anyway, Cruise Records, you look at these things, you almost had like independent economies in the 90s. Like when people were selling, like you look at Slapstick, they were, talking to Brandon on the show, he was talking about how they would sell 80,000, but they would sell 30,000 copies of a CD, like sell through back then. Like you had like independent economies. You could go to your like vegan restaurant that was, buying their stuff from a vegan grocery store, that was like buying from local farmers with money that was going in this local record label, like ignoring the petroleum that was going into making these records. But like you had like an independent economy there.
Yeah. You were making it happen on your own without like somebody like consulting you on how to do it. You were like making it up as you went along. And that made it really special, like making your own flyers, like making your like hand silk screening your 7-inch covers, making your own t-shirts, like all those things. It was very, I don't know, it was empowering. And it was like a kind of a middle finger to like society too. And saying like, we can do this on our own. Like we don't really need your help. We can exist in our own ecosystem, which is like the charm of punk rock, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, definitely. And it feels, that's the one thing that I guess is lost now, is because like at the end of the day, when Discord was doing it, there was, a corporation wasn't going to get a piece, but now at every level, like, you turn on your phone, a corporation is going to get a piece. If you log onto the streaming service, the corporation is going to get a piece just because, I'm not bemoaning this because this is just the reality now.
Mm-hmm. Yes. The whole delivery system has changed. We've those CDs are no longer in our hands, like to get them to people, it's got to travel along the super highway, and along that way, there's a lot of different moving parts.
Well, and I guess it's also kind of like null and voided the whole major label argument in a way to me, because it's just like we're all on a major label. Like our whole society's on a major label now.
Yeah, I think it's funny because I feel like people don't care about that anymore. I don't meet people who really care anymore. But it was definitely like, you remember, it was like life and death back then. It was like really serious. I was thinking about this, and you may have a better answer to this than I do. I was trying to think of the bands that you know of or I know of that turned down a major label offer.
Probably No Effects.
Yes. I think No Effects. I know Snapcase turned down because I think Victory kept them happy.
I think who's one time we got asked by Victory to do a split with Tragedy, but Tragedy turned it down.
Oh, I could totally see Tragedy turning it down.
I was like, there's no way they're going to say yeah, but if they would do a split with Victory, I will definitely be on that split too.
Oh my God. Right. Yeah.
But no, there are a couple others, but like, few and far between. I guess like Fugazi obviously probably was approached. I certainly by some
Fugazi was approached, but if like, they'll tell you that they were never asked outright. Like, I think almost like people like never had like an offer to turn down. I don't know if they, maybe they just made themselves very clear that the offer wasn't going to happen, or maybe even like even if you were a businessman, you would probably know enough about music to realize that once you signed Fugazi, they were probably no longer something you could sell to people, like it might have been a bad investment. Like of all bands, Fugazi was the one that you can't tamper with the formula. But yeah, but it's funny because I think about all of the hand wringing over like major labels and like everything that, we did as fans and bands did. And in the end, like, it seems like 98% of bands or 99% of bands said yes. They did it and then once they did it, then you had you had either had the horror stories or the success stories, and so, yeah, that's the age that I grew up. And I grew up like reading Steve Albini's op-ed about a major label being like trying to get through like a pig slop or something like that, and in the end, like, you're just gonna get shit on anyway. I forgot what it was. So like, and like, I grew up watching, Jawbreaker sign and then putting Dear You out, which was like a really controversial record when it came out, it like polarized their fans, polarized everybody who was listening to it. And so to grow up in a time where you were watching your favorite bands kind of get destroyed by these labels and like not recover from them, it scared you away from that for sure. Like, you saw it as like this evil empire.
But you and I are from a hardcore world where it was even more orthodox than that. Like, I remember when we signed to Jade Tree, some guy telling me it felt like he got kicked in the nuts. And another guy, I found out subsequently, telling, Yannick from Tragedy telling people that it was over for Fucked Up, like it was really, like it was so militant.
Oh, dude.
The scene that we came out of.
Absolutely. Because I came out of like, that hardcore scene in Chicago.
Yeah, exactly.
In the late 90s. And so when Rise Against started, I was like a sellout immediately just by playing in a band with the guys from 88 Fingers Louie. You know what I mean? Like, and then when we signed to Fat Records, holy shit, I might as well have done like a commercial for Target or something. You know what I mean? Like, it was like, my friends gave me so much shit. I'd show up to like, the Strife show, right? And walk in and be like, "Oh, did Fat Mike drop you off in his private jet?" Like, my friends had such a good time giving me shit. And then like, if we pulled up in a van, it was like, "Oh, did Fat Mike buy you that van?" Like all these things. And so it's so funny because like nobody's teeth is sharper than the Chicago hardcore scene in the late 90s. You know what I mean? So like when people like that's where I grew up. And so if anybody ever tried to give me shit after that, I was always kind of like, nah, man, you don't understand. I've already been through the ringer of ringers. You know what I mean? Like the people closest to me who I respect their opinion, they've already like heckled the shit out of me. And so if you think that what you have to say is going to dig in to like what is now pretty bulletproof armor, then like that's adorable, but it's not going to happen.
Yeah, nothing a pitchfork writer can write in a review would hurt as much as a whisper you overhear at a DIY show.
It's so true. Yes.
Which actually brings up an amazing, well, not amazing, but a very interesting kind of like, beef that happened back then in Chicago, which is that whole Race Trader versus Charles Bronson thing. How nasty that got. I remember it's funny because Race Trader I remember they were on the cover of Maxim Rock and Roll, and I think that the cover said the most controversial band in hardcore, or certainly was alluded to in the headlines. Like it was like a pretty vicious scene back then, like the divide between these bands, and everyone was still going to shows together. Like that was the amazing thing. Like you'd still be beside these people at shows, but there was real vitriol.
Oh yeah. I mean, I was there for the first Race Trader shows, and Money is a friend of mine, and Hurley is a buddy, and everybody in that band, we'd been going to shows for years at that point. And I knew they were doing a band, but when they played those first shows, holy shit, it was like a needle scratching on a record. Everyone's just kind of like watching the opening band set up. Oh, there's Money in those guys who are all just the nicest fucking people you'll ever meet in the planet. And then all of a sudden Money just goes into the microphone and just tears into everyone there about like white privilege, and burning the idol of the white messiah and all these things. And it's funny because white privilege and the idea of white privilege is something that's very common and like sort of, that we talk about today in today's world, but it wasn't really being talked about a lot in the world back in the late 90s. So it was a very like shocking thing that he had decided, hardcore at that point, at least in my experience, we were targeting big corporations. We were talking about environmentalism. We were talking about indigenous people's struggles, animal rights, et cetera, et cetera. We were targeting the world outside the walls of hardcore, right? That was always the target, was that we're here together in this tribe and the fight is outside these doors. And Money made the fight inside the walls. He made the fight inside the doors. He made it so it's like, I'm going to accuse all of you of some gnarly shit right here on this microphone. And then they go into like some 90-second blast beat song.
Yeah, it's so, I've never thought of it that way too, but they really did kind of like turn that holier than thou kind of like hardcore superiority complex back on itself.
They turned it inward, which people weren't used to. They were used to being like the
condemning everyone else.
Exactly. Then they were comfortable there. That's where we were all comfortable. And so and I think Money's concepts and Race Trader's concepts hold a lot of water, like to this day. He was pointing out a lot about the fact that we were like, a lot of us were from privilege, you know what I mean? Like that we were sitting here talking about all these struggles, but like we were going to go back to like safety and security in like a system that's designed to protect us, a largely white middle class, world. And so he was hitting nerves. And that's why it was so, that's why it was so controversial. And like you said, it was I think it was the cover of MRR and the cover of Heart Attack, like in the same month, like they were obviously, ruffling some feathers, and it was crazy because their message was always way bigger than their band, Race Trader never was that big of a band, but like their message certainly got out, and it was crazy. It was like intense, and I remember sitting there like being like, wait, why is he yelling at us? Like, but then in retrospect, you could see like those guys are really smart people, just in general, like Dan Benai, Money Mustafi, Hurley, like all those guys were, just like intellects, and so their words were particularly jarring because they knew what they were talking about.
And the world's caught up to them, like you were saying, like those, their ideas sound, it's amazing how hardcore's like this, where it's always kind of like, I felt like a lot of things that have come up later in my life, I was exposed to first through hardcore, and certainly
Dude, absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. That's what I always tell people. Like hardcore was my, my secondary education. The first time I heard the word sweatshop was at a hardcore show. The first time I was introduced to concepts around environmentalism was at a hardcore show. Earth Crisis taught me about monkey wrenching, and direct action. Like Los Crudos taught me about, underserved communities right there in Chicago, not far from where we were, and they taught me that there's a world where, no one speaks your language. Like you're not the priority, the language you speak is not the rule of the day. Like we have our own communities and we have our own struggles. And like, hardcore shows were oftentimes benefits for indigenous people, around the world. So you learned a lot about colonialism. And then in Chicago, where we've always kind of been like the forced confession capital of the world as far as like policing, we always had like Fred Hampton and Mumia Abu Jamal, and a lot of questionable police actions that we were doing shows and benefits for all the time. And so you were learning about injustice, and now here we are, right? Like in what is it, 2021? Like this stuff is front and center. They just did a movie about Fred Hampton, and this was stuff that I learned about like at these hardcore shows. And so, yeah, it really was before sweatshop was like a household word, it was like, I heard about Sea Shepherd through like Ignite, and Zoli, like, and then they were Whale Wars and a TV show, and like now the whole world knows about them. Like it really was on the cutting edge. There were a lot of really like just really smart people involved.
Wait, were you at that Ignite show in the basement of Bulldog Records?
I've been.
There used to be an infamous video of that used to go around where there's like a confrontation between someone who's made a zine denouncing Ignite.
Yeah, that was at Fireside actually. What was it? So Chicago's like our local like homegrown hardcore band was called Extinction.
Yep.
And
Pete Wentz played in it for like a brief second too, right?
Yes, but also remember that Pete Wentz played in like every single Chicago hardcore band.
Like, he was definitely a dude that played a lot of bass.
Yeah. Well, Pete made your band cooler just by being in it. You know what I mean? Like he just show up with his like rad style. He would get crowds going. Like the fact that he didn't really know how to play bass was just secondary. He joined all those bands at some point because everyone loved Pete. It was a good time and he made your show better.
Well, it's like the idea of hipsters coming out of punk and hardcore, and it's like those dudes were like the first wave of it, like guys that dressed super well, that knew all the cool bands, that weren't like awkward hardcore dudes, that were like just like
totally
these dudes that kind of like had it figured out. And that's really like the birth. Like those were the dudes that would wind up doing Vice. Those were the people that would wind up doing, Interpol, I guess, and like all that kind of world as well. Like those people figured it out.
Yes, he had his finger on the pulse, and like if he was in a room, he could read it, and he could get a crowd going for whatever band he was playing in. And then so the singer of Extinction, Jim, had a zine called Tirade.
Okay, yeah.
And that was kind of like our hardcore zine. It was interviews, pictures, that kind of thing. And he wrote something disparaging about Ignite, and I can't remember exactly what it was. I'd hate to like speculate, but it was something disparaging about Zoli.
I've got to find this video. This was like something I watched religiously as a kid.
There's a video of the fight?
No, there was no fight on the one I'm talking about. The show I'm talking about. It's just like a verbal.
Yes, argument. That's what I mean. Yeah, I was there for that verbal argument. So, cause I was there, I was back by Jim. Cause Jim he also had a distro.
Okay.
So he would bring his distro to the Fireside shows and he would sell his zine. And then Ignite had showed up, and I guess they must have read the zine in the interview because that was the thing. It was the no internet, right? So this thing had probably been out there, but they were probably on tour and hadn't read it yet. And then they read it. They got really pissed off, and they waited till they went on stage and loaded their gear and like set everything up. And then before they went into the song, Zoli grabbed the mic and he just started yelling. Yelling. And the way the Fireside Bowl works, like the stage could not be further from the merch. You know, it's just one big long room. And like, so Jim's like a mile away in the other side of the room. And it's like probably a few hundred of us in there. And and Jim sat there and listened and then grabbed his whole distro, picked it up and walked out the door. Oh, because Jim was like the kind of the godfather of hardcore, like around that time too. He was like, he did a lot of great things for the scene. He kept the shows going. He was a really solid class act. And he was like, I'm not sitting here and putting up with someone, giving me shit here in my own town. He just left the room.
Yeah. Yeah. Another band that I want to talk to you about is Teppan Nation, right? They were
Teppan Nation. Yeah.
Teppan Nation. Sorry. They were the band that was on the same label that the Baxter 7-inch came out on.
Oh yeah. I don't know much about Teppan. I remember playing shows with them and being friends with them. And then Teppan Nation, the name, it comes from like, it was like, when people from like hundreds of years ago decided that to cure other people, they would drill a hole in their head. I think that was like, you know what I mean? Like to either let blood out, like if you had demons or whatever, like they would drill a hole in your head and that was supposed to like cure you. I think that's what Teppan Nation means. They were kind of oddballs. That's what I remember. They were like I guess they were straight edge kids, but like, I don't remember them being like a part of like that straight edge hardcore scene. They were kind of, just on the outside of it, but always like a cool band and always super nice guys. But I wish I knew more about their story to tell you, but I'm the wrong guy to ask.
The singer was in the band Jesus, who I think is super underrated. I love that band so much. Jesus X was there.
That's amazing.
Yeah, no, I think they've got a song on that All That in a Bag of Dicks comp that is still something I go back to. I don't know. That's the thing. Is there's just so many bands,
yeah, there were.
I had no idea that you played in a band with the dudes from Pelican till early.
Oh yeah. Yeah. It was like super short lived, but like, before Pelican was Pelican, Laurent and Trevor played in a band called Yellow Road Priest. Mm-hmm. Which is actually great because, they were trying to name their band after the Priests, like if you think of the cover of the Rage Against the Machine record of the priest burning himself alive.
Yeah. Yeah.
So they wanted to name their band after what those guys were called. And they were like, and they found out they were called the Yellow Road Priests. And then a few years into their band, someone was like, it's the Yellow Robed Priests. I always loved that. But they were like a kind of like a blast beat, grindy, like cool, like political band. And then I think that towards the end of their tenure, they were losing members, and they asked Neil Hennessy and I to fill in. And I remember doing a couple of rehearsals and maybe even a couple of shows. But like at that point, like I think it's like when you're trying to like plug a hole, keep a band going, but you realize it's not the same. And me and Neil weren't like, our hearts weren't into like blast beat grindcore either. So it was like, but super, super nice dudes and a cool band. And then they wanted to do Pelican. It was, such a rad band.
Oh, an amazing band. I think that's the best thing talking to you. And I've found this over the years talking about this kind of music is because, you were never like in one, obviously you're in the scene, but you're never like dogmatic about only going to this one type of show or this one type of band's kind of clique.
Yeah, it was crazy because I felt really alone in that way because I was like, on a Wednesday night, I was at a Rainer Maria show, and then on a Friday night, I was at a Strife show, like finger pointing with an X on my hand, and like, I loved all of it. I just thought it was so cool. I thought Braid was cool. I thought all those bands from like the polyvinyl scene were cool. Like, I just wanted to like soak it all in. When I left high school, my only plan was to move into the city and see as many shows as I could, and just go to shows and just like, I didn't have to know much about your band for me to like be watching your band. I just loved seeing everybody's take on music. I loved seeing every band from every region like come in and play. This is what we think punk rock should sound like, and they play it for you, And so I loved all that. And then when I did my own band, Baxter, it was like it was sort of like a part of its own ecosystem that we didn't really fit into like a hardcore scene or like a straight up like punk scene, we were kind of our own thing too. So I don't know. I was just a music head, probably in the same way that you're a music head, which I know because you're on like your 300th podcast or 400th podcast. Like you're just like, you must have acquired so much knowledge just from all of these interviews and everything, just hearing everybody's story.
Oh, it's just, that's why I love doing this, because every time I just feel like I'm in, like you're saying, like this is my chosen place of education, like
Right.
once I got into punk and hardcore, like this is actually where I really, really did well in school, is just from studying here. And I find like every time I get to do one of these, I just learn so much, and just help put these pieces together. It's like, it's so wild. You think about the Fireside Bowl, you've got yourself, you've got people that wind up doing Fall Out Boy, you've got people that wind up doing Pelican, you've got people, Los Crudos, you've got CM Punk in there, you've got like this whole room of people.
Alkaline Trio,
like just pop culture would not be the same without this little room of people. And I don't, like you don't really see that in a lot of other music scenes in the same way.
Yeah, I guess I never thought about it that way, but it was a really special place, and it's so, I feel like, it's like if you have to grow a crop, it's got to be in really good soil, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like no matter how good the crop is, no matter how good your seeds are. And Chicago had that really good soil, where it let us all explore music, do our thing very passionately. And also, like, there wasn't a lot of like delusions of grandeur, like we didn't have a lot of roads to success. And so it kind of like it kind of weeded out the people that were in it to get big and rich and famous,
Yeah.
And it made the art sort of come to the forefront. And you had people who were really committed to the art, and they did it because they couldn't not do it, because it was percolating inside them and like coming out. And they were doing it at great cost to themselves. They were doing it. No one was making any money. If anything, you were losing money.
Like you're saying, you don't really have
hit that practice space at like 10 p.m. at night, and play for 3 hours with your friends, even though you had to be back at school or work at like 9 a.m.
And I guess you don't really have that drain from people deciding they want to become famous, like it's not really that, like you're saying, it's not really that thing. The people that are doing it because they love it and they're going to stick around.
Yeah. It wasn't, nobody in it was careerist, at least as far as, I could remember, I think Pete knew that Fall Out Boy was going to be the biggest band in the world, but that's about it.
I've kept you forever, Tim, and I could punish you, believe me, for hours more. Would you come back and do a part 2 at some point?
I would love to. Yeah, I'd be happy to.
But before you go, can I ask you a couple more questions?
Yeah, of course.
I've got this sheet. I'm crossing them off though. Don't worry. We're making progress.
All right, good.
One thing I wanted to talk to you about was this, like, you brought up a few times, is like Victory Records, because it feels like that's like the home base of it. Oh, well, obviously it is the home base of it, but like it feels like that scene is such a, I don't know, it's such an interesting manifestation in hardcore at that time too, because it's almost like, talk about something that's not careerist. I'm not saying that these bands were necessarily careerist on that label, but that label was kind of careerist in a way that other labels weren't.
Yeah, it's true. And like, I can't like overstate how important like some of those early Victory bands were to like my musical upbringing, like everything from like, By the Grace of God, Guilt, Bloodlet, Refused, Snapcase, Earth Crisis, Strife. I was at all those shows. You know what I mean? Like that was a huge, I was at that point, like I was subscribing to anything Victory was putting out. You know what I mean? Because they put it out, it was really cool stuff. And then in the Chicago scene itself, I'm sure anybody that you talk to from there would tell you there was like this big wall between like the scene and then Victory Records. There was like not a lot of like the scene didn't have a lot of love for like Victory, and like the people that ran it, and so it existed as like its own separate entity, and
a little fight.
But yeah, exactly, yeah. But the music they were putting out, was like really important music, and I loved it. I loved all those records for sure.
Oh yeah, no, it's like like you brought up those bands there, and you can go. There's just so many bands like Warzone. There's like at that time,
Warzone.
it was the label too, but like it almost was in the same way, like that people like turn their nose up at J Tree and Fat Records in the DIY scene. Like Victory was definitely had that kind of stink too. So it was, like separate worlds. It feels like.
Totally, yeah. And the bigger it got, the more like the Chicago scene had a problem with it, right? And that's just kind of like the nature of scenes. But like, but it was cool that like these bands that we love, called this label from our town home, and it was always exciting to see these bands come to Chicago. I mean, even Warzone played their last show ever in like my hometown, like at a Knights of Columbus Hall, Yeah. And it's like, and I remember, and Rabies was like super cool with like everybody, all my friends, and, left like a mark just even in my own little town. And so we got a lot of really cool experiences like that, probably because Victory was here.
And bringing up Rabies, a band that's on the Rabies tribute comp. Before we went on air, you mentioned that you slept on a member of Cold as Life's floor one time. What band did you guys play with that was playing with Cold as Life?
That was Rise Against. It was early on. I mean, God, you'd have to ask Joe like specifically. I don't remember who it was, but I remember we played a show. I think it was those guys were like St. Louis, or like that area. Or no, those guys were Detroit. Yeah. We'd played a show somewhere, and then I think it was just somebody who was working in security or something, and they were just like, "You need a place to crash," and like we're like, "Yeah, sure," and that's where we ended up. It was just like on somebody's floor. Luckily, after that, there was no crazy story. You might think that, that happened. It wasn't all pit bulls and strippers, it was like
very
more
chill.
it was more like sleeping bags on someone's floor, but it was always like, God, those Detroit shows, I think, was it Jeff who was security there at those shows? I want to say.
I think some of those dudes did security. I think Big Dog, I think, did security for a lot of the shows as well, who was in Cold as Life. They definitely, okay. I think after they had taken care of the problem with security guards at Blondie's, I think they became the security.
Oh, okay.
I think they dealt with the problem with security, God. And then they were like, okay. And but yeah, like it's, I don't know, it's the Detroit stuff. It's fascinating because it is definitely, as real as stuff gets in other places, like the shit there just felt on another level of real.
Yeah, like we always played like St. Andrews and the Shelter, and like that was the neighborhood around there definitely kept you on your toes a little bit, and so it was always an experience, that's for sure. It was like always somebody in the van or by the van, trying to make sure that we still had our gear when we left there. Detroit had its own vibe. That's for sure. There's like Michigan, then there's Detroit, and like those are two different things. and you were probably really close to Detroit, I imagine, or I mean like closer.
Yeah, no, geographically, like they were. It's funny because when Jeff was on the show, I told him, like, growing up, you were the band to us that, like, even more than maybe the Cro-Mags, like, that people just talked about, like those legends that you brought up earlier, like they were the band that you just heard legend after legend of, because there wasn't necessarily the internet, so it was very regional. And like, we had Grade and we had Chokehold, but like they were that band for us.
Right. That's pretty cool. That's pretty special.
Yeah, this has been pretty special, Tim.
Good.
I have had an amazing time, and I hope you've enjoyed it a little bit. But anytime you want to come back on here and get punished more about Chicago, we barely even scratched the surface with Rise Against. So I feel,
you're right.
A lot more room to grow.
Anytime. Yep. Anytime, Damian.
Thank you, Tim, for coming on the show. And you heard right there, we got to have Tim back for a part 2. He's the guy that can connect all these disparate scenes for me. He can fill in all the blanks in my memory from this time period in Chicago, all my unanswered questions. And thank you, Tim. Thank you. Anytime you want to come back here, buddy, and talk about the greatest punk scene of the 90s, the Chicago DIY punk scene of the 90s, the door is always open. And speaking of talking about this scene, we are not going to stop, because we are continuing the Rise Against Nowhere Generation celebration with Joe from Rise Against coming on the show. And I've wanted to have Joe on the show forever. My God, did I punish the shit out of him at a snow jam. in like 1998. He was there just checking it out. It's after 88 Fingers Louie broke up. And I was like, oh my God, it's the guy from 88 Fingers Louie. And I went up to him and I was like, hey man, what are you doing? And he told me about Rise Against. He's like, yeah, it's going to be, I think I got to run this by him to see if there's something he said. But I think I remember him saying, this is going to be huge. And at the time I'm like, oh, cool. But look at that. It is huge. He might not have said that. I might just be making that up in my memory. But it'd be cool if he did, because he was right. He's damn right. That thing's fucking ginormous. One of the biggest punk bands. You know, it's a wild thing about Chicago giving us, you know, most of the biggest punk bands that are happening right now kind of come out of this DIY scene. Anyway, I'll be talking about this in a few days. You're going to hear me talk about this again. So I will quiet down for now. That's it for the show. Remember, as always, Black Lives Matter. The lives of Indigenous people matter. We need to protect trans kids. We need to help trans people protect themselves. There needs to be a stop of hate and violence towards Asian people, and hate and violence towards people that have different beliefs, different faiths. Just fuck. This is all fascism. Like all, just oppressing someone for this is some Nazi bullshit. You know, this is stuff that isn't politics. This is just like human rights issues, these things, you know, and people just want to be free and live their lives as best they can. So, yeah, I'm not telling you what to do with your life. I'm not, you know, telling you what to believe. I'm just pointing out the obvious, that these are human rights issues. And so, sign your organ donor cards, because by the time they come for those organs, you don't need them. You're like, just go, just get them out of me. Well, you don't say anything, but you know, that's what the card's there for. So this is your organ donor card. And they're like, oh, I don't need those organs. Go out and do something creative for yourself. Create your own culture. Start a band. Start a fanzine. Look where it goes. Look where it goes. Tim from Rise Against. You know, like his band that is, you know, influenced people all over the world. Start DIY 7 inches. You know, that's what this show's all about. You know, it's the ripple effects that, you know, you can create. So start creating them. Start creating them. You know, you don't have to show anyone. You don't have to try and be Rise Against. You can try and just be, you know, Jandik and make it for yourself, you know. And then eventually you want to tour, because, you know, who could blame Jandik? He wants to go out and see people respond to his work, you know. Anyway, you go out there and change the world. Love each other. And I'll see you next episode on the show. It's a very tiring week. If you're listening this far in, and you're like, oh man, he seems he's very wiped these days on these intros and outros. I am, because I'm recording these things at like 3:00 in the morning by the time I'm done everything else. So thank you for bearing with me on these things. You know, it'll go back to normal one day, and I'll be able to work during the day again, I hope. But that's it. Listen to Oil and Flowers with Buddha Blaze and myself, and I'll see you next episode.